War is complicated, and all of us should be focused on Ukrainian people and how to help them. Unless, of course, we can make some money out of it, then we should probably do some warmongering. Hello there, you 5.1 million awakening wonders. The conversation continues. While you may feel afraid, while you may feel doubtful because you live in a complicated world at complicated times, know that here at least we can have an open discourse, an open dialogue. I mean, admittedly, you have to just use the comments and I get to use my mouth. But together at least we can try and reach some different conclusions, some different outcomes. And even if we don't reach conclusions, we can certainly make a commitment to grow together, put aside prejudice and bigotry and get moving in the right direction. You know I'm appearing live all over the UK. If you want to come see me in Hull, Newcastle, Scarborough, Sheffield, Bristol, Glasgow, there's a link in the description to come and see me in all these places. It's a fantastic live show. It's an atmosphere of freedom, conviviality, humour, laughter, a little bit of chaos, and even sometimes some meditation. I urge you to come and join this fantastic experience. Come see me. There's a link in the description right there. Now, we're still talking about, obviously, what's happening to Ukrainian people, the horror of war. We're talking about the complexity that it brings up, with some people just seeing Putin as a villain, what do you think? People say he's terrifying, he's the new Hitler. Other people saying, well, there are complex economic and historical reasons that have led to this, but even so, none of that diminishes the rights of Ukrainian people to live lives free from horror and terror and incendiary devices. And really, if you're looking for something simple to feel here, then a simple thing we can feel is sympathy and compassion and love for those that are directly affected by this suffering. And we can together look for ways in which we, as people, let's face it, who have very limited power, it's difficult even to elect a government in your own country, let alone stop a war in another one. So we're going to look at what kind of conditions and circumstances lead to this conflict. Of course, you'll be aware of the adage, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. We have been in comparable situations before, certainly not with the same protagonists, but certainly many of the same principles. Here is Condoleezza Rice appearing on Fox News. Condoleezza Rice was, of course, high up in the American government during the Iraq War period and the war against terror.
Well, and I have argued that when you invade a sovereign nation, that is a war crime. I mean, I think we're at just a real...
Condoleezza Rice just nodding her head there, trying not to betray that somewhere inside she must be thinking, we did sort of invade Iraq, who were not really connected to the 9/11 attacks. We know that now, but at the time we said they were.
Basic point there.
Well, I'd agree. It is certainly against every principle of international law and international order, and that's why throwing the book at them now.
How can you throw that book? You've only just rewritten it. Cross out that bit where it says you can't invade Iraq. Right. Now throw the book at them.
In terms of economic sanctions and punishments is also a part of it. And I think the world is there. Certainly NATO is there. He's managed to unite NATO in ways that I didn't think I would ever see again after the end of the Cold War.
Wry little joke there about international politics. And of course, Condoleezza Rice has clearly achieved some incredible things in her life. But when it comes to the matter of protecting the sovereignty of an independent nation, there is an obvious hypocrisy at play. None of that mitigates the suffering of Ukrainian people, but what it does do, unfortunately, is undermine the legitimacy of Western criticism. In her roles as National Security Advisor and Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, along with the rest of the Bush administration, created an imaginary scenario that Iraq and Saddam Hussein were responsible for the attacks on the World Trade Center in New York City on September the 11th, 2001. Leading the US into the illegal invasion of Iraq, killing millions of innocent Iraqis along with 4,000 US soldiers. She was responsible for one of the most radically dishonest statements ever made to the American people when she warned that unless Iraq were attacked, Saddam Hussein might very well launch a nuclear war against the United States, leaving a mushroom cloud in some unspecified American city. Now, of course, what I want you to be aware of is that I am sensitive to the complexity of the current situation. Russia have invaded Ukraine. That's wrong. America invaded Iraq. That was wrong. At the time of the American invasion of Iraq, a discourse was created to legitimize the invasion of Iraq. Still, people didn't want it. Millions of people protested. As a result, millions of people unnecessarily died. Here, there is a different situation. Russia have already invaded Ukraine. People are dying. People are suffering. What I suppose we have to be aware of, and what's important, I believe, to keep in our mind, is that the media that we consume and the figures that are on it are not reliable voices when it comes to us reaching our own conclusions. Now, I don't know enough about Russian history or Russian foreign policy or Russian expansionism to offer you a clear opinion on whether or not there should be a war between America and Russia. My sense is that of the many unpleasant, unfortunate, unnecessary, awful outcomes available to us, that is one of the worst ones. Also, I don't agree with appeasement. I suppose these are times when we have to recognise the limitations of what we can achieve unless we become an organised and ordered people ourselves with a meaningful voice when it comes to disputes of this scale. Rice approved and apologised for numerous war crimes on behalf of the Bush administration. She also allowed torture to displace diplomacy as the hallmark of the US foreign policy. Employing circuitous logic about Nixonian explanations, Rice recently explained away our misunderstandings about torture and international obligations. By definition, if it was authorised by the president, it did not violate our obligations in the Convention Against Torture. Wow, that is incredible, because Nixon famously said, it's not illegal when the president does it. And I know that that's an idiom many of you are familiar with. It's okay when we do it. And one of the great challenges about the Russian invasion of Ukraine is our inability to stay with a straight face. It's wrong to invade Ukraine. Stop it. We are going to prevent you from a peaceful, non-biased, non-profitable perspective. Without making a penny from weapons, without drawing a veil over our own hypocrisy, we are going to do what is best for Ukrainian people. We're going to do everything in our power to stop this war. That's what everybody wants. That at least is simple, but not available due to history. 19 years ago, in March 2002, it was the US invading Iraq. Today, it's Russia invading Ukraine. Here we are 19 years later, and Russia does not care about the international outrage of their invasion of Ukraine, just as the United States did not care about millions of people all over the world walking, marching, and protesting against the US war on Iraq. The fact that these two things are comparable does not make what Russia are doing right. Obviously. The American military establishment and our domestic war culture must always have a villain, a cause, a war. Great sums of money must be spent, weapons quickly deployed, people killed, cities razed. Now Ukraine is the pawn. America has bombed a sovereign country every day for the last 20 years in Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia and Yemen. Yet that is never part of the story we tell ourselves. Our long history of assimilating other lands into our own, of meddling in foreign elections, of overthrowing governments, invading other countries, of torture, leaves us with little room to speak when others breach international law. But it does not seem to prevent our government, our news media, our own selves from repeating the war myth of Americans as the good guys and everyone else as evil. It's become our bedtime story, one that seeds a nightmare. It's clear there is an appetite on both sides of this conflict to create a simple and easy to follow narrative. On one side, US corruption means that there is no moral legitimacy to US actions, and the knowledge that American companies will profit from weapons sales nullifies any moral stance they may take. I find that argument somewhat appealing myself, although I acknowledge that that leaves Ukrainian people faced with an immeasurable and terrifying threat. The other argument is that Putin is somehow unique, that this invasion is different from invasions that are supported by the West, that we have an obligation to step in to find ways of preventing it, ways that will likely lead to military expenditure and the loss of military lives. Don't you feel that an issue of this scale and complexity, comparable in a way to the pandemic, except for the immediacy and gore of its consequences, demands of us personal reflection and an acknowledgement that the changes we require as a society, as a planet, are so radical that when it comes to crisis, we're ill-equipped to deal with it. We can't turn to a set of principles and values and say, oh no, something terrible is happening. Who are we? What is it that we do when we're confronted with this again? We can't turn to a collective grandmother or grandfather and say, what did you do when it was the Nazis? Because it's not the Nazis anymore. That's why the language revolves around those kind of reductive tropes. Obviously, I, Russell Brand, the bloke out for Getting Sarah Marshall and Big Brother's Big Mouth, do not have an easy set of suggestions for how to resolve a geopolitical conflict which includes issues as diverse as a gas pipeline, American military-industrial complex needs, Russian expansionism, the history of left versus right, post-Cold War trauma, post-pandemic inertia among ordinary citizens. What it makes me recognize is that we are ill-equipped spiritually and psychologically for the times we find ourselves living in, that this is an invitation for us as individuals and as society to awaken and to address what we want from each other and what we want from the world, what our shared and collective priorities are, what our individual priorities are. Because once there is war between Ukraine and Russia, it's too late. There is no good outcome now. Either there's a version where people amplify the need for war in order to sell weapons, or there's a version where people don't offer sufficient support to Ukrainian people, so more people suffer on the ground, not to mention the obvious subsequent economic and refugee crisis that's doubtless coming. We've allowed ourselves to get into this situation. If this was a crisis between individuals, you'd say you have to listen to all points of view and come to a conclusion. You have to be willing to admit you might be wrong. If this was an individual health crisis, you'd say, why don't we make sure there are regular health checkups rather than waiting until there's an emergency? This should be a wake-up call. This should help us to recognize that we don't trust our governments anymore. We don't trust our media anymore. We don't have a shared set of values anymore. Of course, Ukrainian people are what's at the core of this now. Any measures that are available to be of assistance to them, to be supportive of any measures, any ideas that are anti-war. These are the thoughts and notions that should be promoted to the forefront of our collective mind. And we should remember, as part of our own domestic political discourse, that we want leaders and governments that are responsible, that have values and principles, that are a reflection of the people that we truly are. Then you won't find yourself invading Iraq. Then you won't find yourself strangely stymied when an aggressive act occurs against Ukrainian people. Military aggression should be stopped. International lawlessness condemned, territorial boundaries respected, human rights violations prosecuted. That's nice, isn't it? There's something that we can hang our hat on, something simple that we can observe. To do that, we must model the behaviour we claim to esteem. That makes sense, doesn't it? Right, okay, we're getting somewhere. Let's create societies that give us a moral platform upon which to speak. Do it in a way that becomes learned in each of us and the rest of the world. Only then will transgressors be few and truly isolated, unable to function in the international arena. We don't have any principles or integrity as nations or communities anymore. I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about the systems of governance. I'm not even talking about the individuals within them. I'm talking about the unconscious ideals we have allowed to dominate our culture for much too long. This, along with the pandemic, is a call for awakening. This is a wake-up call for the Ukrainian people. It's already a hideous disaster, the same way as in the countries that we're in right now. Homelessness, disease, death, despair, suicide are the immediate effects of a foreboding and forthcoming disaster. It serves as a reminder that we need to reevaluate the way we structure our societies, the principles that we deploy when creating financial, economic, sociological systems. War is not genetically set in our bones, and these problems are not divinely created. We made them, and the myths surrounding them, and we can unmake them. We must believe this if we are to survive. Our reality is created through the decisions we make and through the beliefs that we hold. That may seem too ethereal to those of you who are very focused on the suffering of Ukrainian people in this moment, and I can understand why it would. But when you consider how we got here, these are the kind of ideas that are fundamental if we are to create a different world. Perhaps the systems of nationhood, the systems of globalism, the systems of commerce, the systems of resource mining, our whole Weltanschauung has to be re-examined if we're to prevent something as fundamental and as tragic as war. But that is just what I think, and God knows I only fleetingly think it, because this is a complicated situation that requires continual dialogue, that requires constant updating, where no one can claim to know everything about it. And the voices, obviously, that are most important are the voices of Ukrainian people, and part of the tragedy is we won't hear those voices until it's too late, if at all. Let me know in the comments below what you think about this situation. Let me know what media sources you trust, what decisions we ought to be making. Let me know how spirituality and fundamental issues about the way you regard reality affect something that's this geopolitically complex. If you enjoyed this video, have a look at this one or this one. Remember, I'm live all over the UK, Glasgow, Bristol, Blackpool, loads of places. There's a link in the description. Come see me, and as best as you can, through whatever means you deem necessary for yourself and those that you love, stay free.